The bitter wind of December 26, 1776, cut through the Continental Army like a blade through paper. But it was nothing compared to the desperation that gripped General George Washington's heart. Standing on the banks of the Delaware River, he watched his ragged soldiers, many barefoot, their bloody footprints marking the frozen ground, prepare for what many believed would be their final campaign. The American Revolution hung by a thread thinner than spider silk, and Washington knew that without a miracle, the cause of liberty would die with the coming dawn. The situation was beyond dire. British General William Howe had driven the Continental Army across New Jersey in a series of humiliating defeats, capturing Fort Washington and Fort Lee with ease. The British and Hessian forces controlled most of New Jersey, and enlistments in Washington's army were set to expire on New Year's Day. Thomas Paine's words echoed in every patriot's mind. These are the times that try men's souls. Indeed, they were times that would either forge a nation or bury a dream forever beneath the frozen soil of winter. Washington's brilliant victory at Trenton on December 26th had provided a desperately needed morale boost, but the British were far from defeated. Colonel Johann Rall lay dead, and nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers had been captured in that surprise attack. Yet the larger British forces, under General Charles Cornwallis, were mobilizing for a crushing counterattack. The Americans had won a battle, but the war remained perilously close to being lost. As reports filtered in from his scouts, Washington learned that Cornwallis himself was marching south from New York with 8,000 fresh troops, determined to trap the Continental Army at Trenton and end the rebellion once and for all. The British general had been humiliated by the Christmas surprise, and his pride demanded immediate satisfaction. "At last we have run down the old fox, and we will bag him in the morning," Cornwallis reportedly told his officers, confident that Washington's amateur army could not escape the trap being set. The American position seemed hopeless. Trapped against the Delaware River with British forces converging from multiple directions, Washington faced the grim reality that his army might be annihilated before the new year dawned. His men were exhausted from the Trenton assault. Their ammunition was running low, and the bitter cold continued to take its toll on soldiers who lacked proper winter clothing. Many officers privately wondered if the time had come to seek terms with the British and abandon the revolutionary cause. But Washington was not a man to surrender easily. As he studied his maps by candlelight in his headquarters, the general's mind raced through possibilities, searching for some stratagem that might yet save his army and the revolution itself. The key, he realized, lay not in direct confrontation with Cornwallis's superior forces, but in mobility and surprise, the same elements that had brought success at Trenton. If he could somehow slip away from the British trap and strike an unexpected blow elsewhere, he might yet turn the tide of war. The plan that began to form in his mind was audacious, risky, and perhaps the last hope for American independence. The second day of January, 1777, dawned gray and forbidding as Cornwallis's forces closed in on Trenton like a tightening noose. The British general had deployed his troops with methodical precision, positioning cannon and infantry to prevent any escape route for Washington's trapped army. Skirmishing had already begun along the Sunpink Creek, where American riflemen harassed the advancing British columns, buying precious time for their commander's desperate plan to unfold. Washington had spent the previous evening in hurried conferences with his most trusted officers. The audacious scheme he proposed seemed to border on madness, while leaving a skeleton force to maintain campfires and create the illusion of an army in position. The bulk of the Continental forces would slip away under cover of darkness and march 18 miles through the frozen countryside to attack Princeton, where British reinforcements were stationed. It was a gamble that risked everything on a single throw of the dice. According to historical accounts from the National Archives, the decision to march on Princeton was made with full knowledge that failure would likely mean the complete destruction of the Continental Army. Washington's officers were divided. Some believed the plan was too dangerous, while others recognized it as perhaps their only chance for survival. The general himself seemed transformed by the desperate nature of their situation, displaying a fierce determination that inspired even his most doubtful subordinates. The preparation for the night march began in absolute secrecy. Washington ordered his men to wrap their musket locks in cloth to prevent the metal from clinking, and wagon wheels were muffled to deaden the sound of movement. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a thin layer of ice covered the roads, making travel treacherous for both man and beast. Yet these same harsh conditions would help conceal their movement from British sentries. As darkness fell on January 2nd, the Continental Army began its most perilous journey. The column stretched for miles along the back roads of New Jersey, with Washington riding among his troops to encourage the men and ensure the march proceeded according to plan. Many soldiers were still suffering from frostbite and exhaustion from the Trenton engagement, yet they pressed forward with grim determination. Understanding that their survival depended on reaching Princeton before dawn, the route chosen by Washington's guides took the army through some of the most difficult terrain in the region. They had to navigate frozen streams, dense woodlands, and rugged farm roads that threatened to break wagon axles or lame horses at every turn. The bitter cold was so intense that some men collapsed from exposure, while others left bloody footprints in the snow as their makeshift shoes fell apart. During the grueling march, behind them at Trenton, a small force under the command of officers who had volunteered for what might be a suicide mission maintained the deception that the entire American army remained in position. They kept campfires burning brightly and moved about with exaggerated noise to convince British scouts that Washington's forces were preparing for a dawn battle. Along the Sunpink Creek, every hour they could maintain this illusion brought the main army closer to Princeton and their desperate objective. As the hours passed and the column trudged through the darkness, Washington rode from unit to unit, his presence serving as a beacon of hope for men who had already endured more hardship than most armies could survive. The fate of the revolution rested on their ability to reach Princeton undetected and strike a blow that would shake British confidence in their control of New Jersey. Dawn was approaching, and with it, the moment of truth. The pale light of January 3rd, 1777. Crept across the frost-covered fields surrounding Princeton as Washington's exhausted army approached their objective. The college town lay quiet in the early morning stillness, its streets empty except for British sentries who had no idea that 4,000 American soldiers were closing in from two directions. The general's daring night march had succeeded. Beyond his most optimistic hopes, they had reached Princeton undetected, and the element of surprise remained theirs. Washington had divided his force into three columns for the final approach. General Hugh Mercer would lead his brigade along the back road toward the Stony Brook Bridge, while General John Sullivan's division would advance along the main Princeton road. Washington himself would accompany a third column as a reserve force, ready to exploit any breakthrough or respond to unexpected developments. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: strike hard and fast, before the British could organize an effective defense. The British garrison at Princeton consisted of approximately 1,200 men, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, a veteran officer who had served with distinction in numerous campaigns. Most of these troops were members of the 17th Light Infantry, 55th Foot, and 40th Foot regiments, along with mounted dragoons and artillery pieces positioned to control the main roads. Mawhood had received orders from Cornwallis to march toward Trenton with reinforcements, believing that Washington's entire army remained trapped there. As fate would have it, Mawhood had already begun his march toward Trenton when the American attack commenced. His column had just crossed Stony Brook when his advance guards spotted Mercer's approaching brigade through the morning mist. The two forces collided in what would become known as the Battle of Princeton, though the fighting began in the fields and orchards outside the town proper, where neither commander had expected to encounter the enemy. The initial clash erupted with sudden violence as British light infantry opened fire on Mercer's advancing Americans. The New Jersey countryside echoed with the crack of muskets and the shouts of officers trying to maintain order as both sides deployed from column into line of battle. Mercer's men, already exhausted from their night-long march, found themselves facing disciplined British regulars who quickly gained the upper hand. Through superior training and positioning, General Mercer himself became an early casualty of the engagement when British soldiers surrounded his position near the William Clark farm. The brave officer, who had served as a surgeon before taking up arms for the Patriot cause, was bayoneted repeatedly by enemy troops who mistook him for Washington. Due to his similar appearance and uniform, his fall sent shockwaves through the American ranks, as Mercer was beloved by his men and respected throughout the Continental Army for his courage and medical knowledge. The British advantage seemed decisive as Mawhood's disciplined troops pushed forward with fixed bayonets, their red coats brilliant against the white snow as they advanced in perfect formation. American resistance began to crumble under the professional assault, and panic spread through some units as men who had never faced British regulars in open combat realized the deadly efficiency of their opponents. For a moment, it appeared that Washington's gamble had failed catastrophically, but the sound of gunfire had alerted other American columns to the battle, and reinforcements were already moving toward the sound of combat. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery unlimbered their guns and began firing into the British ranks, while fresh Continental troops moved up to support their embattled comrades. The battle for Princeton was far from over, and the outcome would depend on which side could better adapt to the chaos of unexpected combat. On a frozen January morning, the crisis at Princeton reached its peak as American resistance wavered under the disciplined British assault. General Mercer lay mortally wounded in the frozen field, his blood staining the snow red, while his demoralized brigade began to give ground before Mahood's advancing regulars. The British had seized the initiative. With their professional competence and for terrifying moments, it seemed that Washington's bold gamble would end in disaster. The fate of the revolution hung in the balance, as panic threatened to spread through the Continental ranks. It was at this crucial moment that George Washington demonstrated the personal courage and leadership that would make him legendary. Spurring his white charger forward, the commander-in-chief rode directly into the chaos of battle, positioning himself between his retreating men and the advancing British bayonets. His towering figure on horseback, clearly visible in his blue and buff uniform, served as a rallying point for the wavering Americans. "Parade with us, my brave fellows," Washington shouted above the din of combat. "There is but a handful of the enemy, and we will have them directly." The general's personal intervention transformed the entire character of the engagement. Soldiers who had been ready to flee turned back to fight. Inspired by their commander's fearless example, Washington rode along the American line, seemingly oblivious to the musket balls whistling around him, encouraging his men with words and gestures that restored their fighting spirit. His aide-de-camp later recalled that the general exposed himself so recklessly to enemy fire that several officers pleaded with him to withdraw to a safer position. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Library of Congress, Washington's horse was actually shot from under him during this phase of the battle. Yet he continued to direct the fight on foot until another mount could be brought forward. The sight of their commanders sharing their dangers and refusing to seek safety, while his men fought and died, had an electrifying effect on American morale. The tide of battle began to turn as fresh Continental units arrived and deployed to support their embattled comrades. Captain Hamilton's artillery proved particularly effective in breaking up British formations. The young officer, who would later serve as Washington's most trusted aide and the first Secretary of the Treasury, directed his guns with deadly precision against Mahood's advancing columns. The British advance stalled under the concentrated American fire, giving Washington the opportunity he needed to reorganize his forces and launch a counterattack that would drive the enemy from the field. The British position became increasingly untenable as more American troops arrived and deployed for battle. Sullivan's column had completed its approach march and was now threatening Mahood's flank, while Washington's reformed brigades pressed forward with renewed determination. The professional British soldiers found themselves outnumbered and surrounded, facing an enemy that had transformed from a demoralized rabble into a coordinated fighting force. Through the inspiration of their commander's personal example, Mahood, recognizing that his position had become hopeless, began an organized withdrawal toward Princeton. The British officer conducted the retreat with skill, using his light infantry and cavalry to screen the movement of his main force. While American pressure continued to mount, however, the damage to British morale had already been done. The psychological impact of being forced to retreat by the same amateur army they had been chasing across New Jersey would have far-reaching consequences. The fighting gradually shifted from the open fields into the streets of Princeton itself, where British soldiers sought to make a final stand among the buildings of the college and surrounding structures. American forces pressed forward with growing confidence, sensing that victory was within their grasp. The sound of gunfire echoed through the quiet streets as the battle entered its final phase, with Washington continuing to lead from the front, his presence ensuring that his men would not falter when success seemed so close at hand. The battle for Princeton streets transformed into a deadly game of cat and mouse, as British soldiers took defensive positions in the college buildings and surrounding structures. Nassau Hall, the largest building in Princeton and the centerpiece of the College of New Jersey, became the focal point of the final resistance. Its thick stone walls provided excellent cover for the British garrison, while its commanding position overlooked the main approaches to the town center. Captain Hamilton's artillery pieces were quickly repositioned to deal with this stronghold, their iron balls smashing into the building's facade with devastating effect. The American assault on Nassau Hall became one of the most dramatic moments of the entire engagement. Washington's soldiers advanced through the streets in small groups, using buildings and fences for cover as they closed in on the British position. The defenders poured musket fire from the windows and doorways, but their ammunition was running low, and more importantly, their morale had been shattered by the unexpected American attack and the death of several key officers during the street fighting. British resistance began to collapse as American pressure mounted from multiple directions. Sullivan's troops had swept around the town's eastern approaches, cutting off potential escape routes, while Washington's main force pressed the attack from the south and west. The remaining British soldiers found themselves trapped in an increasingly hopeless situation, surrounded by enemies who showed no signs of retreating despite having marched through the night to reach this battlefield. The psychological impact of the American victory was becoming apparent even as the fighting continued. British soldiers, who had spent weeks chasing Washington's ragged Continentals across New Jersey, were now fleeing in disorder from those same troops. The myth of British military invincibility, already damaged by the surprise at Trenton, suffered another severe blow as disciplined redcoats abandoned their positions and sought safety in flight, rather than face capture or death in the streets of Princeton. As resistance crumbled, Washington ordered his men to show quarter to surrendering enemies, demonstrating the discipline and humanity that would characterize the Continental Army. Throughout the war, British soldiers who threw down their arms were treated as prisoners of war rather than rebels, a gesture that would have significant propaganda value in both America and Europe. The general's restraint and victory showed that the American cause was guided by civilized principles, rather than mere vengeance. The capture of Princeton was completed within 2 hours of the first shots being fired. American casualties were relatively light, approximately 40 killed and wounded, while British losses included nearly 300 prisoners in addition to those killed or wounded in the fighting. More importantly, vast quantities of military supplies fell into American hands, including cannon, muskets, ammunition, and provisions that Washington's army desperately needed for continued operations. The strategic implications of the victory extended far beyond the immediate tactical success. Washington had proven that his army could not only survive British pursuit, but could strike back with devastating effect when the opportunity presented itself. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton demonstrated that the Continental Army remained a formidable fighting force, despite its recent setbacks, and that the British strategy of crushing the rebellion through overwhelming force was far from successful. News of the Princeton victory spread rapidly throughout the colonies, providing a desperately needed boost to patriot morale at a time when many Americans had begun to doubt whether independence was achievable. The image of Washington, leading his men in person against British regulars, became a powerful symbol of American determination and courage. For the first time since the dark days of the retreat across New Jersey, colonists could believe that their cause might yet triumph over the world's most powerful military force. British confidence, meanwhile, suffered a corresponding blow. Cornwallis, who had been so certain of trapping and destroying Washington's army, now found himself chasing shadows while his own garrisons fell to American attacks. The psychological warfare aspect of Washington's strategy was proving as effective as the military tactics, as British commanders began to question their assumptions about American capabilities and resolve. Even as his soldiers celebrated their stunning victory at Princeton, Washington's strategic mind was already focused on the next challenge, escaping before Cornwallis could arrive with his superior force to trap the Americans in their moment of triumph. The British general had undoubtedly heard the cannon fire and would be marching north with all possible speed, determined to avenge his humiliation and prevent Washington from escaping a second time. The race was now between American mobility and British numbers, with the survival of the Continental Army hanging in the balance. Washington demonstrated his growing mastery of 18th century warfare by refusing to be seduced by his own success, while his men were eager to press their advantage and attack other British positions in the area. Their commander recognized that discretion was the better part of valor. The Continental Army had achieved its primary objectives, restoring morale, capturing crucial supplies, and proving their fighting capability, but attempting to hold Princeton against Cornwallis's approaching force would be suicidal folly. The American withdrawal from Princeton was executed with the same precision that had characterized the night march and the morning attack. Washington ordered his troops to gather all captured supplies and weapons, while maintaining security patrols to watch for British reinforcements. The wounded were carefully loaded onto wagons, including the mortally injured General Mercer, whose sacrifice had contributed significantly to the victory. No American soldier would be left behind if it could be avoided. The choice of retreat route revealed Washington's deep understanding of New Jersey geography and British psychology. Rather than returning toward Trenton, where Cornwallis would expect him to go, the American commander led his army north toward Morristown, threading through the Wasatch Mountains where British cavalry would be less effective and artillery more difficult to deploy. This mountainous terrain would provide natural defensive positions if pursuit became too close, while also offering multiple escape routes if the situation deteriorated. As the Continental Army began its march toward the mountains, Washington could reflect on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in just 1 week. The demoralized force that had fled across New Jersey in December had been reborn as a confident fighting unit capable of outmaneuvering and defeating British regulars. The crossing of the Delaware, the surprise at Trenton, and now the victory at Princeton had restored American faith in their cause and their commander. The psychological impact of Washington's brilliant maneuvering extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. British officers who had dismissed the Continental Army as a rabble of undisciplined farmers were forced to confront the reality that they faced a genuinely dangerous opponent, led by a commander of exceptional ability. The easy conquest of the American colonies that many British leaders had predicted was clearly not going to materialize as expected. Cornwallis himself arrived at Princeton just hours after Washington's departure, his fury at being outmaneuvered, again barely contained. The British general found only empty buildings and the debris of battle, along with clear evidence that his opponent had once again escaped what seemed like an inescapable trap. The pattern was becoming disturbingly familiar. Washington would strike where least expected, achieve his objectives, and vanish before superior British forces could respond effectively. The march to Morristown represented the final phase of one of the most brilliant campaigns in military history. Washington had transformed a desperate situation into a strategic triumph. Through a combination of careful planning, personal courage, and tactical innovation, his army, which had seemed on the verge of dissolution just days earlier, was now safely ensconced in winter quarters where they could rest, refit, and prepare for the campaigns to come. The British were left to contemplate a radically changed strategic situation. Their easy dominance of New Jersey had been shattered, their garrison troops were demoralized, and their Hessian allies had been shown to be vulnerable to American attacks. Most importantly, the rebellion that many British leaders had expected to collapse during the winter of 1776 to 1777 was clearly far from finished. Washington's army had survived its darkest hour and emerged stronger than ever, ready to continue the fight for American independence. The winter encampment at Morristown provided Washington and his officers with their first opportunity to fully assess the remarkable transformation that had occurred during the 10 days that shook the world, as historians would later call the period from the Delaware crossing to the Princeton victory. What had begun as a desperate gamble to save a dying revolution had evolved into a masterclass in strategic thinking, tactical innovation, and inspirational leadership that would influence military theory for generations to come. The immediate effects of the Princeton campaign were visible throughout the American colonies, as news of Washington's victory spread like wildfire. Recruiting stations that had been nearly empty in December suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers eager to join the Continental Army. The myth that British forces were invincible had been thoroughly shattered, replaced by a growing confidence that American arms could prevail against the world's most powerful military machine. Farmers, merchants, and artisans who had wavered in their commitment to independence now rallied to the patriot cause with renewed enthusiasm. The international implications of Washington's success proved equally significant, though they would take longer to fully materialize. European observers, particularly in France and Spain, had been watching the American rebellion with skeptical interest, waiting to see whether the colonists possessed the military capability and political resolve necessary for successful independence. The professional competence displayed by Washington's forces at Princeton provided crucial evidence that the Americans might indeed be worthy allies in the global struggle against British power. British strategic planning underwent a fundamental reassessment in the wake of Princeton. General William Howe, the overall British commander in North America, was forced to abandon his assumption that the rebellion could be crushed through a single decisive campaign. The resilience and tactical skill demonstrated by Washington's army made it clear that the war would be a prolonged affair requiring substantial British resources and careful strategic planning. The easy victory that many British leaders had anticipated was no longer a realistic expectation. The personal transformation of George Washington himself may have been the most important long-term consequence of the Princeton campaign. The Virginia planter, who had accepted command of the Continental Army in 1775, had been an amateur soldier with limited experience in large-scale military operations. The man who led his troops to safety in the Morristown Hills was a seasoned commander who had proven his ability to outthink and outmaneuver professional European officers. His confidence in his own abilities and those of his army would prove crucial. In the difficult years ahead, the tactical innovations employed during the Princeton campaign became standard elements of American military doctrine throughout the remainder of the war. Washington's use of rapid movement, surprise attacks, and strategic withdrawal demonstrated that conventional European military thinking could be successfully challenged by commanders willing to adapt their methods to local conditions. The flexibility and initiative shown by American officers at all levels provided a stark contrast to the rigid adherence to established procedures that often characterized British military operations. Perhaps most importantly, the Battle of Princeton established the psychological foundation for ultimate American victory in the Revolutionary War. The knowledge that they had defeated British regulars in open combat gave Washington's soldiers an unshakable confidence in their own abilities and their cause. This psychological advantage would prove decisive in later battles, when American forces faced overwhelming odds but refused to surrender, because they remembered Princeton and knew that British soldiers could be beaten. The legacy of Princeton extended far beyond the immediate military consequences that influenced the very character of the emerging American nation. Washington's brilliant campaign demonstrated that Americans possessed not only the courage to declare independence, but also the intelligence and determination necessary to achieve it through military action. The citizen soldiers who had marched through the frozen night and fought in the streets of Princeton became living symbols of American capability and resolve, inspiring future generations to believe that no challenge was too great for a free people to overcome. As Washington settled into winter quarters at Morristown, he could take satisfaction in having saved both his army and the revolutionary cause. Through one of the most brilliant military campaigns in history, the Battle of Princeton had indeed been a tactical move that shook British confidence, but its ultimate significance lay in its role as a foundation stone for American independence and national identity.